Welcome to The Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel. And although we're going to talk about a more historical topic today, I think it should just be brought up that part of the current context under which we are recording this antidote episode is the a chemical weapon, an apparent chemical weapons attack this last weekend in Syria, I believe in East Ghouta again, with it being very quickly blamed by many of the Western powers, including the United States, on Bashar Al Assad's government, and a quick escalation here. And just over the night, in the early hours, there were apparent missile strikes on Syria, and it looks like it was done by Israeli F-15s. And I believe they were striking at this previous airbase that they'd said had been involved in the incident with the drone that they'd confronted earlier. And so this is also in the context of the ongoing Israeli snipers shooting at unarmed Palestinian protesters, including killing dozens of people and injuring hundreds of people, and now recently including the killing of multiple journalists. So maybe we can dig a little bit into the context and the history of how did we get to here in relationship to our current political, geopolitical scenarios that are so deeply involved and wrapped up in the geopolitics of the Jewish state, and especially the relationship of the Jewish state with powers within the United States and also in the old world in the UK. So that's the context which we are engaged in right now, and so we will have to lay that aside for now in terms of a current geopolitical analysis in honor and in necessity to understand our historical conditions and how we might have gotten here, and whether there might be a key to unlock our present by understanding our past.
Jeremy, that's a perfect summary of everything, and I think a generalized topic. I think today we're going to be focusing on things that kind of more affect our modern history more domestically than in terms of just foreign policy. But I think the topic we're discussing today is vital to understand in terms of historical context with both much of our modern domestic history as well as history having related to foreign policy. And that topic is we're going to be following up on what we discussed. We discussed a lot about the B'nai B'rith last week, I think in relation with the Martin Luther King assassination, and then in other contexts as well. This week we're going to be jumping into more specific topics related to the to B'nai B'rith and its origins, as well as rooted in very much in the Confederacy in the American Civil War, and then going into some of the very disturbing connections, I'd say, from most of the information we're going to be taken from the mid-20th century, tying in the Anti-Defamation League to organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. But before we get started, I know you have something you wanted to say about sourcing and using various sources as articles, and the importance of being able to differentiate, endorsing everything that comes from a source with actually some type generalized just judgment of a source was related to specific information, because I think there's probably a little bit of there may be some uncertainty among some of the sources that are being used, that we're going to use for this article today. So I know you wanted to take a few minutes to talk about that.
Yes, it's a complex scenario when you're dealing in these kind of realms where there are some original source documents, such as books like biographies or autobiographies of some of these historical individuals, such as people like Simon Wolf, one of the most important high-level elements not only of the Confederacy, but then also the birth of the B'nai B'rith, the Judeo Masonic society that sort of linked up, comes out of, or it's not clear exactly the relationship with Scottish Masonry, Scottish Free Rite Masonry. And so there's always an issue about where do we get our sources from? And so I just wanted to point out that there's this is something that I sort of thought through a little bit as I began to work into activism in the 9/11 Truth movement. Very early on, I realized that there were actually different functions in a way. There was a 9/11 truth movement with the emphasis being on the truth. So that's a factual analysis, and an analysis focused on what happened, who did it, why, these kind of scenarios. But then there's also this idea of justice, and these are things that are more lead into political ideas or political commitments or political principles. And the way that I might think about it is things like justice, peace, and freedom are terms that I believe to be core to my politics. And we may even throw in things like dignity as key also to that. And so at some level, there's got to be an ability for us to separate our willingness to take on sources to be able to ferret out what is the truth, the nature of facts. And that would also then hook into the idea of the trivia method of grammar. And then how do you then tie that with relationship to logic and then political rhetoric and differentiate one's own political commitments, one's own political goals from the sourcing of facts? And we've been doing, as we've dug into a lot of this history of the Anti-Defamation League and the B'nai B'rith, some of the best sourcing on this, and also even when we got into things like the Mega Group, the group of Jewish Zionist billionaires, mainly hovering around North America, that were so apparently influential in the axis in relationship to U.S. Israeli politics, that some of the best and only sourcing on some of this information does come from either the Lyndon LaRouche organization itself, the Executive Intelligence Review, I think it's called, or people, journalists who are very much associated with him. And there's interesting, questions and debates around the entirety of that whole politics. I've, had interface with them sometimes with people like Webster Tarpley, who comes also out of that milieu. And although I don't, I'm not a LaRoucheite per se, and there's areas of their political, the way that they practice politics, that I think is a little bit on the edge of sort of a little bit group thinky, a little bit political cultish. But at the same time, they are very strong researchers, and some of the core of their politics is should be considered. So I just want to point out that when we use sources, it doesn't mean that we are fully embracing the beyond the truth and the facts of that source. All it means is that we find it to be a well fact-checked, credible source for the nature of the truth included in that source, not necessarily that we hook up completely with the political means and or ends of these groups. And so that would include like someone like Bill Cooper, who is one of the other people who actually worked through some of this article that we're going to work through today from the LaRouche organization about the ADL, and did it on the radio and gave his own take to it in a way that's very importantly documented now on the internet in an oral form, basically. So I guess that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And in this case of this, it's like, I mean, I'm not too familiar with the LaRouche movement. I'm a little more familiar with Bill Cooper based on listening to a lot of his old programs that he recorded. And yeah, there's some issues there with all of these entities. Certainly, another issue that another website that I think we reference a lot, and there's issues there. It was with Veterans Today, but I think that in the context of this, I think that it's important that when these organizations are doing what we strongly perceive to be very thorough research on a particular topic or whatnot, I think that it's important to to lay this information out. And it's I would say with regards to this article, though, I mean, I'd say that take the information that we present and look through the articles written by the Executive Intelligence Review, or go through the Bill Cooper 7-hour series of programs he did on the Anti-Defamation League on B'nai B'rith. Take the information for yourself, kind of take it, and then I would say take it a step further and uh, let's try to validate it for ourselves here. But I think it's troublesome to have knee-jerk reactions when you see certain names or entities pop up. I think we should just try to go by the facts. There's always going to be trouble involved with those, but I think it's important to try and go by the facts. And with regards to this, this does appear to be extremely well verified and extensively researched work. And so, I mean, if anybody, and we would also welcome a very valid critique of it as well. Unfortunately, the only critiques that are out there of this are attempts by these same B'nai B'rith ADL type entities to just politically persecute people involved in the LaRouche movement, including Lyndon LaRouche himself. So I think let's just take the information that's provided and let's run with it and let's create an analysis. And it doesn't mean that you have to endorse the LaRouche Pact or endorse William Cooper per se. I think it's just let's take the fact that and the information that's laid out here and let's try to create an honest narrative of our modern history with it. So I think and these entities are discussing things that really aren't being discussed anywhere else that we believe are vitally important in understanding a lot of the context of how modern deep politics works. And so anyway, with that all said, we're going to break this down into a couple of areas here that we wanted to discuss specifically from this article, The Ugly Truth of the Anti-Defamation League, which is from the Executive Intelligence Review, which is a publication of the LaRouche movement published on LaRouchePact.com. And I believe you might also incorporate another article from the same source into this, into what we're discussing here. But first of all, we're going to get into some of the origins of the B'nai B'rith and how there's a a common origin, common ties in the establishment of the B'nai B'rith sect of Freemasonry, as well as the Confederacy in the American Civil War, and even a little further after the war into the origins of the Ku Klux Klan. So, Jeremy, do you want to read some of this information regarding the origins of B'nai B'rith, going back to this British element within the Freemasonry?
Yes, and just last thing about sourcing is that sources clearly are important, especially in relationship to fact checking, and it's important to consider whether facts have been checked and to consider criticism of a factual nature. And then the other thing is that it is important to try to pick sources that are not reactionary in a way, or that do not bad jacket the information. And this is a very difficult area of consideration, and I think we should continue to have that conversation as we move forward. But last thing that I would make a plug for is that our politics is really, I think, what's most important, that we begin to think on our own in a new fashion that considers the best of some of our political traditions, but that's willing to stake its own claim and not to just sort of step into whatever political box has already been created for us, which in most of it's just from like a small group of men from a couple hundred years ago. No, we can recreate our own sense of political ideas that's not based on a sort of a weaponized legacy and lineage of terminology or left-right divide and conquer. So that, I guess that's my plug, is like let's pick facts and sources as best we can and argue about that, and at the same time understand that we have to think on our own behalf in conversation about politics that might actually have to be created of our own accord in a very, very in an intellectually courageous and unique fashion, rather than just relying on things that have been set up for us. So this first article that we're going to get into that talks about the deep background of B'nai B'rith, because of course the so-called Anti-Defamation League comes out directly of the B'nai B'rith, and for a while it was actually titled as the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith, and I believe they've sort of dropped that last part of it more recently, but that's clearly the institutional legacy. And so this is an article that we've talked about before. It actually comes from a journal called The Campaigner, and this is the edition from December 1978 that had to do with, I believe, Zionism and Judaism. And the article that we're going to be reading from is called B'nai B'rith, British Weapon Against America by Paul Goldstein. And I believe this is also LaRouche linked and oriented. And of course, one of the things with the LaRouche is they're very focused on England and the British Empire as sort of the source of most political evil. So that's one aside. Okay, so into this article, there's a chapter title called "Who Were the Traitors?" The British Scottish Rite intelligence agents who played the most prominent role in the subversion of the American Republic before, during, and after the Civil War were Judah Benjamin, Benjamin Peixoto, Albert Pike, and August Belmont. Peixoto was a president of B'nai B'rith. Albert Pike, a Confederate general, was a Grand Master of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry in America. Their superiors were Lincoln assassin Benjamin and August Belmont, Lord Rothschild's personal agent in the United States. August Belmont made his inauspicious arrival in the United States in 1832, a decade before B'nai B'rith's founding. Of Jewish extraction, he later, quote, converted, unquote, to Christianity by marriage into the Perry family, and was never officially a member of B'nai B'rith. The same story of, quote, conversion, unquote, applies to Judah Benjamin. Belmont and Benjamin's long and close association with the Zionist leadership, however, is a matter of public record and might be compared to the relationship of Henry Kissinger and the Zionist lobby today. Belmont, Rothschild's official financial representative in New York, was a British puppet, like each leader of B'nai B'rith. Belmont, whose activity as a British agent was most notoriously conducted through the leadership role he played in the Democratic Party, double-crossing and bribing his way into the chairmanship 1856 through 1876, depended on the B'nai B'rith's leadership in almost every dirty operation he carried out. An exemplary instance was the Belmont Project to create an ultra-revolutionary pseudo-Republican, quote, youth cult, unquote, formation within the Democratic Party. The, quote, youth cult, unquote, project was a British design which went far beyond America. Its architect was British Colonial Secretary Edward Bulwer Lytton, a builder of the British Opium Empire with Palmerston, a leading knight of St. John of Jerusalem, and a man whose writings did most to promote the revival of ISIS worship internationally. In England, Lord Lytton's disciple, Benjamin Disraeli, founded the feudalist romantic Young Englander movement. Similar movements were created by British intelligence in virtually every European country, Young Italy, Young Turkey, Young Russia, and so forth, an international terrorist network at the disposal of the British Empire. In 1845, at the direction of August Belmont, a pamphlet appeared in the United States called, quote, The Position and Duties of Young America, unquote. The pamphlet had been copied in outline from a tract by young Germany British agent Arnold Rouge. The American author was a powerful man in B'nai B'rith, Edwin de Leon. As early as 1515, the Portuguese Marano de Leons were active in the slave trade for New World plantations. They later settled in Charleston, which many Maranos preferred because its, quote, liberal, unquote, state constitution permitted them not merely to trade in black flesh, but to own slaves and plantations themselves. Every member of the De Leon family was a traitor during the Civil War. David De Leon took command of the Confederate Army Medical Corps. Edwin De Leon, author of Belmont's, quote, Young America, unquote, pamphlet, and later consul general to Egypt under the pro-slavery president Franklin Pierce, was sent to Europe by Judah Benjamin on behalf of Jefferson Davis's Confederate government to meet with Lord Palmerston to raise funds for the Confederacy. The De Leon family slave trade partner, Seixas, published a poem in the South Carolina Gazette that fervently extolled the joys of slave trading. Edwin de Leon, whose appointment as Confederate commissioner in Europe came from B'nai B'rith controller Judah Benjamin, joined with George Sanders, a Belmont man and former employee of the Bank of England, to form the youth cult within the Democratic Party, appropriately called Young America. The movement had a threefold program published in a journal also called, quote, Young America, unquote, run by, quote, abolitionist, unquote, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Reciprocal free trade, special cooperation with European British-run Republican movements, ally with Great Britain against Russia and Austria. British formation of these youth cults in cooperation with Zionists internationally was merely a prelude to the formation of an international assassination bureau at the disposal of the high priest of the Scottish Rite. In 1853, Franklin Pierce appointed George Sanders to be U.S. consul in Liverpool, England. August Belmont became ambassador to Holland. Belmont's James Buchanan became U.S. ambassador to England, and Senator Pierre Solé, owned by Judah Benjamin, became U.S. ambassador to Spain. In June 1853, the high priests themselves, Lord Palmerston, the Earl of Shaftesbury, and Lord Russell, brought Sanders, Belmont, Buchanan, and Solé together at a series of meetings in London with Mazzini, Garibaldi, and Orsini of Young Italy, Arnold Rouget of Young Germany, Alexander Herzen of Young Russia, and Kossuth of Young Hungary. Out of this meeting came the International Assassination Bureau of the Scottish Rite Order of Zion.
Real quick note, Jeremy, the irony of this, you hear a lot within, like, I'd say within right-wing, particularly maybe like anti-communist, kind of anti-leftist circles about the revolutionary spirit in Europe in the 1840s, particularly around 1848. And a lot of these entities that are being mentioned here, I think are very indicative of the revolutionary spirit of Europe. It'd be ironic if there's a lot of this origins here of, say, an entity such as the Confederacy, which is portrayed by so many as the bulwark and bastion of, like, kind of fighting for the principles and values of the country, and all the great things that we believe in were founded on. If this was just another arm of this kind of Masonic revolutionary spirit, that'd be quite the irony. It's beginning to sound like it.
Yes, and also to maybe trace forward how similar this sounds in a certain way to aspects of where the alt-right comes out of, and thinking about Dugan and the idea of chaos magic, and I believe that there some of these groups are labeled young. So this idea of the recreation of the sort of constructed revolutionary spirit was not just targeted for aspects of the left, but there's also more and more evidence that there's aspects of the right that also have these sort of youth-oriented, recreate the culture, sort of chaos warfare, chaos magic approach that's very much in line with this kind of history.
That's a great point. And real quick before you continue reading the article, it's also important to point out that the reason, it could be left or right, and I think that in large part it's not so much oriented by ideology, but rather by the need to perhaps destabilize a certain area for a certain purpose too. So I think that plays a lot. I think that probably has a lot to do with it as well. So anyway, I'll let you keep reading here.
Okay. Out of this meeting came the International Assassination Bureau of the Scottish Rite Order of Zion, whose first target was Louis Napoleon of France. A later target was Abraham Lincoln, first in 1861 in Baltimore, B'nai B'rith stronghold, and then the fatal 1865 hit in Washington. Samuel Morse in works cited labeled the American Civil War a, quote, British aristocratic plot, unquote. The vehicle selected by Palmerston, Russell, Shaftesbury et al. For their long-planned rupture of the American Union was a secret society, the Knights of the Golden Circle. It was in the main composed of the leadership of the Scottish Rite Freemasons in America and the leaders and controllers of B'nai B'rith, Judah Benjamin Peixoto, August Belmont, Albert Pike, Jefferson Davis, George Sanders, and others. The Knights of the Golden Circle emerged out of the nullification crisis of 1828 through 32, when South Carolina set a precedent for sectional strife by attempting to secede from the Union over the tariff issue. The state was controlled by De Leon striped Zionist slave traders who controlled B'nai B'rith. In the 1840s, the Knights of the Golden Circle arranged, through Knight General William Walker, with Albert Pike serving under him, the U.S. military expedition into Mexico. something not ordered by the president, and related attacks on Cuba and Central America, whose open object was the seizure of new slave territory, fanning tensions between North and South, which, quote, abolitionists, unquote, made the most of. Subsequently, as the crisis they were building reached a head with Lincoln's election and the waves of secession by Southern states, the Knights of the Golden Circle attempted a coup d'etat against Lincoln's government immediately upon his inauguration. Involved directly were Judah Benjamin, Grand Master Mason Robert Toombs, Scottish Rite Commander Albert Pike, and the leading Zionist banking houses in Baltimore and New York, led by the Seligmans. The Seligmans financed all of the B'nai B'rith's New York front organizations for the assimilation and indoctrination of immigrant Jews, the, quote, German Hebrew Literary Society, unquote, and so forth. The coup would have involved seizure of the capital city's railroads, the treasury, and other strategic points, an assassination of Lincoln en route to the Baltimore stronghold of B'nai B'rith and the Jesuits, and the installation of John Breckinridge, secretly a knight. The object of the coup was to ensure that the Civil War, already inevitable, would be fought out in the North, ravaging American industry and the British interest. The coup had been well planned, and only General Beauregard's premature firing on Fort Sumter gave Lincoln and General Winfield Scott the warning they needed to crush the coup. Immediately, the B'nai B'rith leaders in the Knights assuming leading positions in the Confederacy, with notably Judah P. Benjamin becoming first Attorney General and then Secretary of War under Knight President Jefferson Davis. Benjamin subsequently became Secretary of State, assuming control of the espionage service of the Confederate States. Coordinating with Benjamin's office was a, quote, secret cabinet, unquote, located in British Canada, which helped run the Copperhead draft resistors operation in the North, created by August Belmont, and employing the talents of George Sanders among them. Among the spies in the North directly controlled by Benjamin and the Canadian secret cabinet was John Wilkes Booth. Also at Judah Benjamin's disposal throughout the Civil War was every branch of B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith's networks consisted of those synagogues and Jewish welfare organizations established by Zionist slave traders in the first half of the century. Their deployment was open and loud from the first days of the secession crisis. During the peak of the crisis in 1861, quote, covenant, unquote, Rabbi Morris Rafal of New York City gave a sermon on the, quote, Bible view of slavery, unquote, justifying every hideous aspect of the previous 300 years Zionist fortune-making off black flesh. His sermon was widely praised in synagogues controlled by B'nai B'rith everywhere. The Baltimore Hebrew congregation, established in 1830, received its funding monies from the Dutch banking family of Judah Benjamin. Among its members were the treacherous Friedenwalds, Rabbi Bernard Elomé, in support of Rafal, addressed the congregation on Lincoln's government. Quote, who can blame our brethren of the South for their being inclined to secede from a society under whose government their ends cannot be attained, and whose union is kept together by heavy iron ties of violence and arbitrary force? Who can blame our brethren of the South for seceding from a society whose government cannot or will not protect the property rights, read slaves, and privileges of a great portion of the Union, unquote? Slavery, said Elomé, is, quote, divinely ordained, unquote. Baltimore, a strategically placed port city and transportation center, was a key to the B'nai B'rith's Knights of the Golden Circle's attempted coup against Lincoln and the Confederacy's broader strategy throughout the Civil War. In this city, the Zionists of the, quote, covenant, unquote, and other British agencies planned chaos. In April 1861, rioting broke out between Union soldiers attempting to reach Washington to crush the Golden Circle coup and mobs led by members of B'nai B'rith, Young Italy, and the Jesuits. Persons opposing the mob, quote, were molested, some were beaten and killed, unquote, including one Union soldier, according to eyewitnesses. Printing presses, including those which printed the, quote, Sinai, unquote, newsletter of Rabbi David Einhorn, an anti-Zionist Jew who denounced slavery, were destroyed. Homes were set afire. Train tracks entering the city were destroyed. One of the individuals arrested was Joseph Friedenwald, sire of a leading Zionist family in Baltimore. Opposition to B'nai B'rith within the Jewish community was crushed. Rabbi David Einhorn was run out of town, and to this day he is slandered by B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League spokesman as, quote, merely an abolitionist, unquote. Not only in Baltimore, but throughout the border state area and South, B'nai B'rith lodges were functioning as, quote, safe houses, unquote, and centers for espionage operations directed by Judah Benjamin. It was this that prompted General Ulysses Grant late in the war to issue a directive that all Jews from Tennessee to Mississippi were to be arrested for espionage. Those B'nai B'rith officials and others subsequently put on trial for espionage were defended by lawyer Simon Wolfe. Grant then ordered Simon Wolfe himself arrested. Wolfe's release was secured by the traitor Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War. Wolfe went on to become the president of B'nai B'rith some years later. And here's the last section. B'nai B'rith's KKK. 8 months after Lincoln's assassination in 1865, Judah Benjamin and Albert Pike created the invisible empire of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, out of what remained salvageable from the Knights of the Golden Circle. Aiding them in this project and a Klan leader was a Charleston, South Carolina Zionist named Baruch, Bernard Baruch's grandfather. Judah Benjamin contributed some funds for the funding of the KKK, but the bulk of the financing was handled by the southern branches of B'nai B'rith. The various clans in the United States are controlled by the Anti-Defamation League and related Zionist organizations to the present day. Benjamin and George Sanders subsequently fled to the safety of England, with Pike remaining to run the Klan operation in the South. The operation was modeled on the Scottish rite of Freemasonry, with all the rituals attending thereto. Pike had been one of the intellectual guides of the order and had written extensively on the subject of mysticism and the ancient cults, including books, quote, The Christian Mysteries, unquote, quote, Gnosticism, the Kabbalah, and the Mysteries of Masonry, and Zoroaster of Zarathustra and his doctrines, unquote. Pike described his and B'nai B'rith's worship of the goddess Isis as follows. Quote, it began to shape my intellectual vision, wrote Pike in reference to the Scottish rite, quote, into something imposing and majestic. It seems to me like the pyramids in the grandeur and loneliness whose yet undiscovered chambers of generations of the sacred books of the Egyptians are so long lost to the world. In its symbolisms, which are its spirit of brotherhood and its essence, Freemasonry is more ancient than all of the world's living religions. Another famous quote of Pike's was, quote, Masonry says, be content, compare not your condition with the few above you, that he hath not the wealth of Rothschild, unquote. After the Civil War, Benjamin Peixoto, the former B'nai B'rith president, secured an appointment as U.S. consul to Romania through the intervention of German-born Karl Schurz, a longtime British intelligence agent. As an advisor, Peixoto took along Simon Wolfe, also a B'nai B'rith president. The appointment had been an aim of the Rothschilds and Montefiore's in London. In Romania, Peixoto created the infamous Order of Zion, which helped to destroy the Russian-U.S. Entente that had helped save Lincoln's Union from British intervention during the Civil War.
Wow, that is. Thank you for breaking all that down and getting into the origins here. And here in a minute, we're going to fast forward about a century and bring together some very disturbing ties between the Anti-Defamation League, which has been established in between this time period in 1913 as a result, allegedly, to combat anti-Semitism in the South. And we kind of talked last week in how really it seems that the KKK never does appear that when you really look at a lot of the history and the oral history that's out there within the South, that perhaps the KKK wasn't as much of a threat to Jews as it has been made out to be, or at least in terms of more prominent Jews in positions of influence in the South in that time period. But I want to say before we move on to the talking about what we're going to discuss here with the KKK and the Anti-Defamation League, it's interesting you mentioned that the focus of the LaRouche organization is the British Empire as kind of being the source behind a lot of all the instability in the world, as far as I think Masonry coming out of the British Empire, I think is certainly a major focus of theirs. I think one of the gripes that organizations like LaRouche would get, as well as somebody like William Cooper, and William Cooper constantly would emphasize during his programs that when he's laying this information out, he's not calling it a Jewish conspiracy. He's not saying that this is a Jewish conspiracy, that it's just a conspiracy of Jews to control the world or whatever. He says, Jews are used as they're manipulated just like every other group is, and that organizations such as the B'nai B'rith and their offshoot are key components in manipulating Jews to meet interests and to to be steered a certain direction, just like all other groups are. But I do find it interesting that we could talk all day about Jewish power, and obviously one of our major focuses is pointing out the disproportionate Jewish influence within so many areas and uh, power circles. But it is interesting how these organizations that are not about a quote unquote Jewish conspiracy, in many cases, they are doing more, and I think effectively with articles like this, exposing Jewish power than a lot of individuals and entities who say that they're all about exposing the Jewish power over us. I think that that's an irony that I think is coming out here in this article, because while it's not just say portraying Jews as just being an all-encompassing conspiracy of Jews running the world, it's pulling no punches when it comes to actual Jewish elements within these criminal networks, and so I find that very interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Greg. And because whether it's this long-term relationship of organizations such as the B'nai B'rith and the ADL, two groups that are considered hate groups and in many ways are considered hate groups against Jews, or whether you consider the idea of the early Zionists and their clarity on the topic of the anti-Semites, so-called, as their best friend, you see, or even if you go delve into maybe the more long-term approach to this subject, which would be in the book From Yahweh to Zion by Laurent Guyonneau, translated by Kevin Barrett, that actually talks about the long-term Jewish hierarchical, Jewish elite construction of making sure that the lower level Jews were eternally afraid of the outside in many ways, and thus would cling to their leadership. So that I do think is key to understand, that not only what you point out, that some of the groups that may not focus on the idea of the quote unquote Jewish conspiracy are not only doing some of the best detailed fact-based research of it, but they're also not playing into the obvious hands of these same dominating and in many times criminal elements at the highest levels of these power structures inside of the Jewish community.
For sure. And it's funny how you don't hear about this information, yet all you hear about promoted in the media are the people who, in a lot of cases within, like, say, the alt-right, who just go on and on constantly about a Jewish conspiracy, but really in a lot of ways run cover for both for Jewish power as well as other elements of power. So I find that one more very fascinating. And so I think here at the very end of this, after we're finished with this next portion, we're going to try to tie all of this together and to kind of have a conversation at the end of our show about why this matters and why this historical information is so vitally important to understand, especially in the current age of Trump, with all of the racial division we have going on and the extreme right once again rising up as being a major force in this country, according to organizations like the Anti-Defamation League. I think we're going to try to tie together why the historical analysis of this is so important to understand, particularly in this current day and age with the current domestic situation the way it is, as well as the situation in Europe. So we're going to get to that here to close out. But first, we're going to lay out some information about really disturbing information tying the Ku Klux Klan and the Anti-Defamation League together via one of the most, I think, one of the most famous and one of the most consequential, you might call it, political assassinations of the 1960s in terms of the of what was going on in Mississippi in the mid 60s with the height of the Ku Klux Klan's, I guess, resurgence in the South in the 60s in the era of the civil rights movement. So we're going to go ahead and let you read some of this information that ties the ADL and the KKK together at one of the most crucial times for race relations in American history.
Yeah, so now moving into a long article, basically a small book titled The Ugly Truth About the ADL, and skipping over about 100 years of history, as you pointed out, where it's moving through Simon Wolf's machinations surrounding the Confederacy and the assassination of King, but then even into the early 1900s and his role in relationship to President Teddy Roosevelt in terms of early support for the rise of aspects of Bolshevism in Russia, on through the sort of the heavy elements surrounding Zionism and World War I, and all of that, and including skipping over the actual founding of the Jewish state of Israel and the key backing of Harry Truman, President Harry Truman, who, by the way, was also a high-level, I believe he's 33rd degree Freemason in outside of Kansas City, Missouri, but also the push to get Truman to immediately back Israel also had a very strong B'nai B'rith element to it, where Eddie Jacobson, his long-term friend, had been given a B'nai B'rith award and ultimately was sort of massaged and coaxed and asked to be the go-to guy to convince Truman by the head of B'nai B'rith at the time and another strong B'nai B'rith element. So that element is there throughout this history. So skipping forward, at the end of a chapter about some of this aspect of the history, including the relationship of the ADL to the JDL, the Jewish Defense League. Okay, this is on page 92 of the copy that I have.
Wow.
Or page, it's labeled page 70, but it's 92 of the PDF. Just as the B'nai B'rith had quietly steered other Jewish American groups to smuggle arms into Russia on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, the ADL ran the, quote, Jewish underground, unquote, from behind the scenes, often going through the motions of publicly denouncing the JDL violence to make sure that no direct links were ever surfaced. The next section is titled ADL's Ku Klux Klanners. Mordechai Levy, the leader of the JDL splinter group that managed to show up on the doorsteps of Alex O'Day and Sherim Subzokov on the eves of their assassinations, maintained direct and frequent contact with the ADL's fact-finding division head, Erwin Swoll. Just 2 weeks before the AADC's Washington, D.C. office was blown up on November 29th, 1985, Levy had appeared as the featured speaker at a press conference hosted by the Federation of Jewish Organizations of Greater Washington, an umbrella group led by both the ADL and B'nai B'rith, to present a list of, quote, enemies of the Jewish people, unquote. AADC was among the groups listed. On more than one occasion, Levy's provocateur antics nearly exposed the ADL's hand in fomenting domestic violence. On February 16, 1979, Levy, using the pseudonym, quote, James Goodman, unquote, filed an application with the U.S. Park Service in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to obtain permission to hold a rally. The rally permit sought by Levy Goodman was not filed in the name of the JDL. Levy was posing as a leader of the American Nazi Party, seeking a permit for a Ku Klux Klan and Nazi Party rally at Independence Hall, the site of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. According to the rally permit, Levy was planning a, quote, white power rally to show white masses unity of white race and to show the world niggers and Jews are cowards, unquote. Among the paraphernalia Levy listed on the application were, quote, swastikas, banners, Nazi uniforms, KKK paraphernalia, will burn cross, swastika picket signs saying, quote, Hitler was right, gas commie Jews, unquote. Working out of the Philadelphia offices of the Jewish Defense League, Levy organized local chapters of the KKK and neo-Nazi groups to attend the Independence Hall rally. In the case of Trenton, New Jersey, KKK, Levy had an inside track. James Rosenberg, also known as, quote, Jimmy Mitchell, unquote, and, quote, Jimmy Anderson, unquote, a full-time paid employee of the ADL fact-finding division, had successfully infiltrated the local chapter of the Klan. Rosenberg had recently attempted unsuccessfully to get some of the local KKKers to blow up the Trenton headquarters of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. At the same time he was posing as, quote, James Goodman, unquote, neo-Nazi, Levy was also mobilizing the Jewish community and every ragtag left-wing radical group in the greater Philadelphia area to attend a mass demonstration, quote, to confront, unquote, the KKK and Nazis at
Amazing,
Independence Hall.
isn't it?
What'd you say?
Absolutely amazing, isn't it?
Yes. The KKK and Nazis at Independence Hall. All the ingredients were there for a serious riot, courtesy of the ADL. Fortunately, word of Levy's scam on the Park Service leaked out to the Philadelphia press. After one Philadelphia newspaper ran a banner headline, quote, "Nazi rally rouser, really Jewish," unquote, the Park Service yanked the permit. Levy's ADL handlers ordered him to lay low for a while. After all, there was no need to jeopardize Levy or even Rosenberg's standing as professional agents provocateur inside the racist right wing. The ADL had plenty of other aces up their sleeves, and not all of them were Jewish infiltrators. The next section, Goodman, Chaney, Schwerner, and the ADL. One of the most shocking instances of racist violence during the civil rights battles in the South of the U.S. during the 1960s was the execution-style murders of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964. The murders of Andrew Goodman, Robert Chaney, and Mitchell Schwerner sent shockwaves across America and the world, as many people began to realize for the first time that the Confederacy, far from being dead, was very much alive and very much committed to rolling back the tide of equal rights for all races, at least in the Deep South. True to its historical roots in the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry and in the original Confederate secessionist plot, the ADL, contrary to its own published propaganda, lined up squarely with the Klan where it counted the most, with its checkbook. One particularly sordid instance of collusion between the ADL and the KKK came to light in a hail of bullets on the night of June 30th, 1968 in Meridian, Mississippi, outside the home of ADL official Meyer Davidson. When the smoke cleared, a local schoolteacher named Kathy Ainsworth lay dead, and a second man, Thomas A. Terrence III, lay dying after being hit with over 70 bullets fired by 22 local police and FBI agents. Miraculously, Terrence survived the attack. Terrence and Ainsworth, both local Klan members, had been set up. They went to Davidson's home that night to plant a bomb on his doorstep, not knowing that the leader of their own KKK chapter had betrayed them, and that a small army of police and FBI sharpshooters was waiting in the bushes to ambush them. The entire affair had been staged by the ADL. The agent provocateur inside the local KKK chapter who set up Terrence and Ainsworth was one of the killers of Goodman, Chaney, and Schwerner. Alton Wayne Roberts was out on bail awaiting his trial, along with 6 other members of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan for the Philadelphia, Mississippi murders when, in the early spring of 1968, he cut a deal with the ADL's regional director, Adolph Botnick. The New Orleans-based Botnick had been a long-standing friend of the late Guy Bannister, the former FBI special agent implicated by District Attorney Jim Garrison in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And I just want to make a quick point on in relationship to the previous episode about King, that this might have something also to do with the connection of the Patsy Ray's handler giving him a phone number that was apparently to the New Orleans element of the apparently of the ADL, and how there was some concern about King's turn towards Palestinian solidarity, Arab solidarity. Back to the article. Botnick, with the blessings of Meridian-based FBI Special Agent Frank Watts and Meridian Police Detective Luke Scarborough, agreed to pay Alton Wayne Roberts and his brother Raymond Roberts $69,000 to become the League's paid agents provocateur. $25,000 in unmarked $20 bills was hand-delivered from New Orleans to the Roberts brothers just days before the Ainsworth-Terrence ambush. At the time the deal was struck, the White Knights, led by the 2 Roberts brothers, had been on a 9-month bombing spree. The brothers were prime suspects in 10 separate acts of racist violence in addition to the Philadelphia murders. 3 of these attacks were directed against synagogues and Jewish leaders in Mississippi. The Roberts brothers, as per their deal with Botnick, ordered 2 of their Klan underlings to deliver the bomb to Davidson's home. They then tipped off the FBI and the local police about the exact time the attack would occur. In return for their continuing services to the ADL after the Davidson incident, the brothers were given slap-on-the-wrist sentences and placed in the FBI's witness protection programs. For his part in the Goodman, Chaney, and Schwerner murders, Alton Wayne Roberts spent less than 3 years in jail. The Meridian incident was classic ADL. The League used the, quote, racist attack, unquote, against Meyer-Davidson as a scare tactic fundraising ploy. Does this, on the side, doesn't this sound a little bit like things like Charlottesville and the subsequent millions of dollars that flowed into ADL and Southern Poverty Law Center coffers?
Yeah. Or for that matter, the thing that happened in Montana with Richard Spencer and the Daily Stormer was all involved in this conflict with this Jewish attorney, and as a result of that, not only money go pouring in the ADL and SPLC coffers, I'm sure, but I think the Daily Stormer ended up raising like a cool $250,000 out of that. So
yeah, and who knows whether how much of that money was that flowed into Meyer Amschel Anglin's coffers was actually from the Rothschilds. Okay, I'll get back to this article here. The money they raised more than covered the cost of buying up the two KKKers as their permanent agents, agent provocateur, inside the Klan. The League parlayed their financing of the Roberts brothers into an ever closer relationship with the FBI, which was delighted to have the ADL finance and deploy two of the Klan's most violent terrorists. And I just want to get into the very beginning of this next chapter just to sort of point out where this may go. And then for the last 5 minutes, you can do some analysis, Greg.
For sure.
Okay, so this leads into a picture of a man sitting at a desk with a bull behind him and a phone, a very elegant chair and desk. And then it's identified as Whiskey Baron Edgar Bronfman, the ADL's, quote, friend of Moscow, unquote. This is chapter 6, in bed with communist dictators and spies. On the day in November 1985 that Israeli spy Jonathan J. Pollard was arrested, things went haywire at the ADL's headquarters near United Nations Plaza in New York City. National Chairman Kenneth Bialkin immediately flew off to Israel to assess the damage and to make arrangements for the appropriate American attorneys to be brought in to represent not only the jailed spy, but the other more senior players in the nominally Israeli spy ring. Among the most important of those senior players was Colonel Aviam Sela, an Israeli Air Force war hero who had been Pollard's recruiter on behalf of the secret Israeli techno-spy unit Lakem. On a side, isn't that Arnon Milchan, producer of JFK the film? Sela's cover for his spy recruiting was that he was in the United States taking graduate courses at New York University. And Sela's wife, Ruth, a practicing attorney, reportedly was working on the staff of the ADL's legal department while the couple lived in New York. Any published links between the ADL and Life Pollard spy apparatus could naturally prove very damaging, especially in light of the cozy relationship the League was enjoying with the Reagan White House at the time. So last two paragraphs. While still in Israel, Bialkin telephoned fellow ADL man Leonard Garment of the politically powerful law firm of Dickstein Shapiro. Garment was then the personal lawyer for U.S. Attorney General Edwin Meese. He agreed at Bialkin's urging to represent Sela in the Pollard matter, despite the obvious severe conflict of interest. At the ADL's Washington, D.C. office, Mir Lansky-Boland was also undoubtedly worried that her own links to Pollard might surface. Lansky-Boland had been a classmate and pal of Pollard at the graduate school program in national security affairs at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy of Tufts University in Cambridge, Mass. Upon graduation in 1978, both Lansky and Pollard had been immediately placed into sensitive posts in the U.S. intelligence community. Pollard had gone into naval intelligence and had almost immediately begun funneling secrets to Israel. Lansky-Boland had gone to work for the Central Intelligence Agency. After a 2-year stint with the CIA, she had transferred to the Pentagon, where she worked under Dr. Andrew Marshall at the Office of Net Assessments, a little-known but powerful unit that prepared technical assessments of Soviet military capabilities. In 1982, Lansky had left the government to work full-time for the ADL in Washington. And I'll leave it there, but I just want to quickly point out that the this connection to Andrew Marshall, who's also seen as the Yoda of the long-term strategic planning of the deep U.S. military apparatus, and who's very much tied into the RAND Corporation, is key to beginning to understand this history and this spy network that was apparently facilitated by aspects of the ADL. And that I once heard the CIA pilot John Lear say that the head of the Skunks Work Project, Michael Rich, no, not Michael Rich. Michael Rich is his son. The father ran Skunkworks, and Lear identified him as a long-term Mossad agent. And his son, Michael Rich, is the current head of the RAND Corporation. So this is now should be looked into in relationship to the relationship of the U.S. and Soviet Union, and what the Pollard spy ring might have actually been.
And once again, it comes full circle: domestic and foreign policy. B'nai B'rith and its offshoots, dramatically influencing both American domestic policy and foreign policy. So we ended up coming full circle at the end, and I'm pretty sure we'll be revisiting this. I think that this certainly isn't the last we've discussed a lot of this of the B'nai B'rith and its offshoots. But I'll just close by saying real quick that I think that when we come full circle with the information laid out here about the origins of this of the what became the Klan through the Confederacy, and not just the origins of the Ku Klux Klan, but the origins of much of the Confederacy in general, within the people who actually had the power and influence and were pulling the strings within the Confederacy, and then moving on later 100 years to tying together the Klan and the Anti-Defamation League. And once again, this information is all sourced. So I mean, just take the sources and put it together for yourself if you're not really willing to trust the actual source of putting out this information. But I think when we look full circle with what's going on now in the age of Trump, and once again, we've seen the resurgent right, not just in America, but throughout the West, with this strain of anti-immigration, the strain of pseudo-nationalism and patriotism, and the emphasis on, I think, divide and conquer. We're in a worse situation than we've been in many years, perhaps since the 1960s, with the elevated rise of the old school white supremacy, with sympathies to the Klan, sympathies to the old South of the Civil War days, with this alt-right movement. I think that more than ever, it's important to understand the historical context of this, because when you do, and you realize that it's the same entities that are really steering these groups that are claiming to fight the enemy, as well as those who were raised up as the boogeyman enemy themselves, to scare both Jews and non-Jews alike into many ways into giving up their rights, and also to be put into these ideological boxes where ultimately they'll be convinced to give up their freedoms, both personal freedoms as well as their intellectual freedoms. And so I think that it's more important than ever to understand the historical context of this, especially in a time like now where we see things get very chaotic at any time. I mean, all it would take, it seems, sometimes would be it could be one small event could just create all kinds of chaos. So I think it's very important to understand this context with what's going on now and perhaps where we're headed in the future. So that's how I'd close out.
Well, thank you very much for that very comprehensive analytical perspective, Greg. And before we wrap up completely, I just want to point out one last little avenue of future interest might be this idea of the role of the B'nai B'rith and the ADL in basically washing money, and this idea of the connection to the Lansky mob is part of this document. And I would just point out that from the book Super Mob by Gus Russo, that really shows how some of these Jewish charity networks are really related to the washing of some of this mob money. On page 508, it talks about how Mo Dalitz, who is very much tied into the Lansky mob, in 82, Dalitz received the Torch of Liberty Award from the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. And so we'll have to leave that there. But this one Kenneth Bialkin, who is the head of the B'nai B'rith, who was mentioned earlier, and also was the head of the B'nai B'rith, I believe, at the same time that Mo Dalitz was given this award, is also tied into aspects through SCAD and ARPS of the 9/11 people who were involved in the 9/11 payoffs, one Sheila Birnbaum. So people should go check that out. So until next week, Antidote. We out.
All right. Talk to you next time.